Welcome back to the channel, guys. Hope you're keeping well. So today I have got 3 warnings for you before we start. Warning number 1, this phone has got too many features to cover in one single video. For an example, just before I started reviewing the phone, I found out that at the back where the camera is, you can actually customize these LEDs into RGB, basically any color that you want, and you can even have them pulsing when somebody makes a phone call. So if I manage to get that right, I'm gonna say, editor, put it in now. If not, that was a little bit awkward. Warning number 2, this phone is amazing. So if I'm talking very highly of it, it's because this is my first phone review, so just be gentle on me. And POCO has given me the grace of having this phone for a month and being able to try it out for a month. So we are going to be treating it more from the tech space, because obviously that is a level of expertise that I hold. But obviously I have used phones for most of my life, so phones are more about user experience. So we are going to be talking about the design, features, specifications, everything that you'd want to know about this phone. But hold in mind that this is a gaming phone. But let's look at this phone a little bit closer. So from the outset, this phone looks like a phone. It's pretty basic with regards to its layout, where the volume up, the volume down is, where the lock button actually that doubles as or triples as a power. It's also where you can access the fingerprint function. The fingerprint function is not actually on the device itself or on the screen. It is the power up, power down button. But here's where it gets a little bit interesting. This phone has got 3 microphones. Now, because it's a gaming phone, the 3 microphones are because your hands are always going to be on the side of a phone and you are constantly going to be having your hands move around. So the reason POCO put 3 microphones on is for in-game communication. Again, if you're playing games like online Call of Duty or Apex or those kinds of games, if you are having team comms and you want to use the built-in microphones, you're not going to have that scraping because it actually auto switches to the preferred mic. Next, it has programmable pop-up triggers. Now you can program them to do pretty much anything. So I've actually had them on screen record, or I would open up an app really fast. So you can set those pop-up triggers to how you want. Now the one, call it negative thing on the design side of things with regards to the pop-up triggers is that I thought it could have popped out a little bit more. When they told me it's got pop-out triggers, I was expecting these things to just like flare out completely, but they pop out a little bit. So on the next design, I would like to see them popping out a little bit or having a little bit more pizzazz. The basic makeup of this phone, on the sides it is metal. So on the back it looks like it's metal, but it actually is plastic, but it looks like it actually be a plastic covering over metal. Now the importance behind having metal sides is because this is a gaming phone, and when we go over the specs you'll see just how highly spec this phone is, and you do want to have efficient cooling. Now obviously metal is more amenable to cooling, especially in a phone that is this compact, but we'll see what happens when we get to the actual performance. Onto the dimensions of the phone. Now this is something important because people like to know what it's going to feel like in their hand, as well as the weight, and obviously people do choose their phones according to size. So let's start off with the dimensions. The height is 162.5 millimeters, the width is 76.7 millimeters, the thickness is 8.5 millimeters, and the weight is 210 grams. Now for me, it is a light phone and its form factor is small, but I have gorilla-ish size hands, but perfect for someone like me. But it is a gaming phone. You do want that nice wide display. Now one thing that we can't talk about is the internal design, because I'm not about to break this phone open, but it does have vapor chambers in that it's liquid cooled. So you can actually find this on the POCO website. I'll bring up an image so that you can see how it's designed, but the thermal design is actually really good, and I can tell you more when we get to performance that I have had phones that when doing normal tasks or running a WhatsApp, as well as, I don't know, checking emails, that the phone does tend to get hot, especially when downloading apps. When gaming, this phone was at about the same type of temperature, but that means that this phone was working at its peak performance. But again, we're gonna get to that when we get to performance. Onto specs, and I'm gonna have to draw a deep breath because phones can get extremely specky. There are a lot of things to consider when it comes to phones, but there are two options when it comes to this phone. Only these two options change, the rest stay static, and that is going to be on RAM as well as storage. Now the two options are you get an 8 gig 128 and then you get a 12 gig 256. The version that I have today is a 12 gig 256. The CPU, or central processing unit, is what derives your graphics as well as the processing power. So this is the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. Now there's two components to look at when it comes to the CPU. First being the actual processing. It is an 8-core processor on 4nm architecture. Not that that really matters if you're just looking to buy a gaming phone, but important for some people. Then it does have the Qualcomm Adreno GPU. Now this phone does clock up to 3 GHz on the processor, so that is really, really strong for a gaming phone, and it is the latest Snapdragon CPU. Connectivity wise, obviously we've got Wi-Fi 6, but it does have an X65 Snapdragon 5G modem or modulator, which means that if you are in countries with rich 5G coverage, this phone is obviously going to have the best upload and download speeds. A lot of phones are coming out with 5G, but it is important to note that this is a 5G phone. Onto display, there is a lot with regards to the display, so I'm going to try and keep the simple specs only. So this is a 6.67 flat AMOLED dot display, so nice rich colors. Its resolution is 2400 by 1080. It has a contrast ratio of 20:9, and it has a brightness ratio of 800 nits. So it is extremely bright, and it's also not a ratio. But anyway, the refresh rate on the screen is 120 Hz, which means that gamers that are playing more demanding games are going to get nice or quicker imagery from the mobile phone, which is going to cause a smoother experience. Now there is a lot more, like it's Corning Gorilla Glass, but again, check the POCO website if you want to know more on the display, because there's a lot more to this display than I've just said. The battery is a 4700 milliamp battery. Now that is extremely impressive because during gameplay, I played Bleach 3D, which is extremely addictive, by the way, for around about 6 hours before I got a dying battery alert. Now what's even more impressive than that is that it charges in 20 minutes. So I've tested this a few times, put it on charge, come back 20 minutes later and it's full. And if you're not playing games, it lasts for about 2 days. Now this is complemented obviously by the 120 watt power charger that you do get, but still something really impressive. Onto cameras, and something extremely important. POCO did not disappoint here, because the front camera is a 20 megapixel camera, but the rear camera, triple camera, let's talk about the main one. If you want to know about the others, you can check the website again. But the main camera is a 64 megapixel Sony camera. Now it is perfect for being able to take really good B-roll, because at 1080 it can do up to 120 frames per second. So I've even used it to film some of my own B-roll. So for those people who are looking to get a nice powerful phone to be able to game and also do content creation, go and take photos, videos, something really cool that this phone does have is a really, really good camera. There are so many more specs and features to this phone that I'm only going to mention a few more. One being that it can take dual SIM, it does have near field communication, it does have haptic feedback, so that if you're scrolling through your menu, you can have the haptic feedback, and haptic feedback actually does have a role in gaming if you want to get that kind of feedback from your games. It also has a quad speaker system that comes out of both sides, so you get the surround sound type of feeling that has been tuned by Dolby Atmos. Now it is loud, and I can only attribute it to being almost like a mini boombox. So what I've done here is I've drawn up a comparative chart so that you're able to see the POCO versus some of its peers, so that you can see what you're getting bang for buck on spec for spec, on phone for phone. So let's go through that. Comparing the POCO F4 GT to other devices in the flagship range, we can see that the POCO is undoubtedly a great choice for your money without having to sacrifice anything spec-wise. So the other devices that I'm going to be comparing to the POCO aren't the best of the best, but it will give you a good insight as to what you're getting for your spend. So with that in mind, the two phones that we're going to be comparing against is the Samsung Galaxy S22 Plus and the Apple iPhone 14. So we're going to bring up all three configs and we're going to look at them side by side. Starting off with the processor, not much is known about the Samsung. I didn't have one to be able to test, but it is an octa-core processor and it goes up to 2.99 GHz. The POCO, as known, is a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 on the 4nm, and that goes up to 3 GHz. On the Apple, we do know that it is an A15. It has 6 cores, and much like the new Intel ranges, it has 4 efficiency cores and 2 performance cores. The efficiency cores go up to 2.02 gigahertz, and the performance cores go up to 3.24 gigahertz. Talking about the main camera, the Samsung comes in with a 50 megapixel camera, while we know the POCO comes in with a 64 megapixel main camera, and the Apple iPhone comes in with a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. Now, it must be noted that cameras are only good as their CMOS sensors, but again, this is just for indicative purposes. When it comes to display, the Samsung is an AMOLED 2X or a dynamic AMOLED 2X, and its resolution is 2340 by 1080. And this is very similar to the POCO, which is also an AMOLED dot display at 6.67 inches with the resolution of 2400 by 1080. Now, we do know that Apple has its own demarcations, so these are available in a 6.7 or 6.1 Super Retina XDR display. Obviously, on all of these models, we chose them with the spaces of 250 gigabytes each, so no difference on those. This is to be able to get a good price comparative. Onto RAM, the Samsung comes in with 8 gigabytes of RAM, while the POCO leads this one quite a long way with 12 gigabytes of RAM, and then moving on to the Apple with 6 gigabytes of RAM. On connectivity, these all have pretty much the same connectivity. Obviously, with the Apple, it's Lightning, but on the Samsung and the POCO, it is charged by USB-C and with the latest Bluetooth, and they are all 5G. Onto operating systems, the Samsung and the POCO run off Android, while the Apple obviously runs off of iOS. Battery, something extremely important, especially when looking at a phone that does gaming. First of all, the Samsung comes in with a 4500 milliamp battery. We know that the POCO comes in with a 4700 milliamp battery with fast charge, and then the Apple comes in with a 3279 milliamp battery. All 3 phones do feature dual SIM. Obviously, this is country dependent because different countries get different options or get different configs per their shipping instructions. Now, lastly, something that I cannot talk about with authority on the Samsung and Apple, but it is cooling or lack thereof. So POCO has put quite a bit of effort and time into making sure that this phone stays cool, and that's something that I do mention in this video, is that while gaming, this phone does manage to keep itself nice and cool, versus other phones where you generally hold them for any given amount of time watching videos and they do tend to get super hot, and that's because all of the components are packed into a very, very tight space. I will put links in the description below so that you are able to look at all 3 of the phones and draw your own comparisons. Now, let's move on with the next part of the video. Time to conclude, and as I said in the beginning, it is a spoiler alert because I enjoyed this phone from beginning to end, from unboxing it, from the way it was packaged, to experiencing it, to gaming on it. Everything was enjoyable. Now, let's talk about some of the negatives. In setting up this phone, it was a little bit troublesome because I was moving from a different phone manufacturer in order to set it up. So being able to synchronize all the data, obviously saying, can you plug the one phone into another? It is very intuitive in trying to take you through it, but I did find it troublesome. During the entire experience, the phone only stalled once, and that's because I was using quite a few different applications at the same time, and I haven't experienced it since. Now, because Xiaomi is a younger phone manufacturer, the one massive plus for me is that it doesn't have so much bloatware. Yes, there's a lot of Xiaomi apps and applications that are running in the background, but there's not too much, and you can uninstall most of them if you don't want that to take up a lot of space. One big criticism that I was going to have is that for about a week, my phone wouldn't ring, and I reset it and I Googled why, and that's because the pop-up triggers are very sensitive and they can do so much. So what had actually happened was my phone was off silent, and I kept on taking it on and off silent, but if you scrolled across one, there is a do not disturb mode, and I figured out once I unticked that, it started working again. So otherwise, no harm, no foul on that. Just make sure that if you do experience that, make sure that do not disturb mode is actually not enacted. For final conclusion, this phone retails, last I checked, at about $14,999, and for all the specs that you do get with this phone, it's a high recommend from me. Really enjoyed it. We'll look at getting one myself on my next upgrade. Otherwise, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please reach out if you do have any questions. Again, again, I couldn't cover everything, otherwise this would be a half an hour review. Otherwise, have an awesome time wherever you are. Cheers and goodbye.